Good afternoon, and welcome to our lunchtime learning webinar. I'm Paul O'Brien. Normally you see Jerry in these, but today, for whatever reason, he's asked me to do the governance, risk and compliance one, and I'm delighted to do that, and look forward to getting it done on time, which I think is the most important challenge that Jerry has issued. And we like to get these things in and over with. It's being recorded, as you know, and available, the recording available when we're done. The introduction, basically, you're familiar with this. For those of you who've been here before, it just gives you an idea of what we are and what we do. And then I go straight into the governance issue. So dealing with three things: dealing with governance, risk and compliance, and then talking a little bit about how they integrate, how they come together, and what's important. So depending on the type of the organization, the relationship between the board and the executive is what makes the whole thing work. There's a mutual respect essential in that relationship. A careful tension is probably important too, where the board has the relationship with the executive, where the executive does a lot of reporting to the board, and that holding to account is important. The respect is critical to good governance. That's probably the bottom line here. And some organizations fail to make in their governance regimes to stay focused on the objectives of the organization. There are different models in leadership terms, but what's common for them all is that the objective, the focus on the mission, if you like. Hard to find definitions for governance. A lot of the ones that you would find if you were to go look talk about the governance of nation states, and some of them actually go back to Roman times. But I like these two. It's a satisfactory way to organize to achieve the purpose on which we're all agreed. And I suppose the all agreed piece is important here, because a lot of the time boards governance fails because of splits, different directions, different emphasis, and different ideas about what the organization should be doing at board level. So it's important that the objective or the purpose is agreed and it stays agreed. A second definition is also useful. It's a structured process. Not many people realize that governance is actually a process. And because there's structure on it, there's rules around it, that makes it easier. Because it's understood, it also makes it easier for new individuals to fit into it. And basically guiding the way forward. It's interesting when you think about that, the notion of the board, the governance regime, because that can be board and it can be executive board members, and it can be the executive team sharing with the board that process to go forward. But bear in mind, and I'm always, I love to quote John McCarthy, Professor John McCarthy, who described forward as having completely different meanings to Attila the Hun and a Trappist monk. So it's important to remember that there are differences of opinion in forward, but to go back to the top one. And if you get one that you can agree on, it'll make for good governance. On compliance, some of you will remember maybe this quotation: the banking crisis in the US and the meltdown, and all of the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation and the stuff that poured out from that. And one of the keepers of that was Paul McNulty. And it's simple. If you think compliance is expensive, try non-compliance. It was both a threat and a promise, and he made good on it. Compliance, one of the big things that people tend to forget, compliance, is that the compliance objectives in the leadership team and in the governance regime, the compliance objectives have to be there. They're ever present. And in training, I would ask this question: how many of you exceeded the speed limit in the last week? Now, I don't need an answer to that, but compliance is that simple. There are rules. everybody is expected to obey the rules, and if we all do, society is better off. And generally, regulation and legislation is about protecting society. Where there's a credible threat of enforcement, that obviously the adherence to compliance becomes stronger. And I'll ask another question: is everybody here tax compliant? There's no need to answer that either, but my suspicion is that more people answered yes to the speeding one than to the tax compliance question. And that basically is the notion of the credible, reliable, and proven threat of enforcement. It's important for a couple of reasons, and the note, the last bullet here, I suppose the two last bullets: the regulatory authority has a responsibility to ensure that everybody complies. And during the banking crisis, one of the things that occurred was a lot of the people at mid layers of management in the banking business knew they were doing the wrong thing in some of the loans that they sanctioned and some of the, basically some of the loan chasing that they did. They knew they were doing the wrong thing, but because the regulation was so poor, one of their competitors, or two of them, were away doing that. So in order to compete, they felt they had to cheat. So the regulatory enforcement is important, and it's important that it is even-handed and applicable to everybody, and seen to be applicable to everybody. Compliance can be regulatory or legislative. It's often dependent, as I say, on the credible threat of enforcement, and it's in its design. It's designed to protect society, whether that's a consumer in the Consumer Protection Code, whether it's data protection in the things like the GDPR, and it's about controlling organizations from a societal perspective against you or my excesses or omissions, and achieving compliance with, first of all, identifying and recognizing the requirements to comply, whatever sector you're in, and achieving that compliance has to be one of the leadership objectives, and that goes back to the governance. In many forms, it's often sector specific, and some of you, for example, if you have somebody in the food industry, they'll know that, oh, there's so much stuff. Anybody in the medical device business will know that there are so many different things they have to comply with, both in the product and the processes. And so every sector, every organization will have some compliance requirements. The big general ones are the health and safety, and tax is usually one of the general ones. And then just to pick some examples of the requirements that are national. Some of them are federal, like EU requirements or US federal requirements, and some are global. Generally, data protection tends to have globalized, and anti-money laundering and counter-finance terrorism. Countering finance terrorism is driven by Homeland Security, and that's one of the big ones. Increasingly, as it turns to regulation and legislation, you're going to hear more and more about ESG, because bear in mind that most national governments, through their federations, like, for example, in Europe, and on to the UN, they made some very, very big global commitments about ESG. So you're going to see more and more of that, and there is a requirement on every organization to have knowledge of that. The risk piece, definition here is from the ISO 31000 risk management standards: the effect of uncertainty on the objectives, or you could add the achievement of the objectives of the organization, is a good usable definition of risk. The achievement of the mission, the purpose, and the objectives always have aspects that are uncertain. Most of the risks are known knowns. They're common. People would be able to sit down and, for any organization, probably list the key risks that they are likely to face, including the compliance one. And I've put that in here as sort of one of the first, any failure to comply with any applicable regulation or legislation. A failure to meet the stakeholders' expectation, or more like who you're reporting to. So, for example, if it's a board, if you're dealing with profit returns, You might be dealing with customer satisfaction, whatever your objectives are. There's a stakeholder out there, or there are stakeholders out there who are expecting you to meet certain things, and failure to do those basically represents some of the risks that you need to mitigate. No growth, poor results, those kind of things. And risk obviously can be upside and downside. Generally what gets talked about are the downsides. It has many sources, internal and external, and it has both sources. It can be both internal and external. It has to be managed. So it has to be identified, assessed, taken and avoided, monitored and reviewed. And that's a process, and that's sort of a continuous process. It has to be mitigated where prudent to do so. So once you've identified a risk, you've got to do something about it. Sometimes people identify risks and poorly describe the risk and wind up trying to boil the ocean with mitigation. And that's to be avoided. And I put the note in here where prudent to do so. Some people would say, well, when is it not prudent to mitigate? Perhaps the mitigation cost gets bigger than the risk cost. That's one of the ways that can happen, and it does. So it's important that there's an intelligence brought to the risk management process, and you look at it and say, well, I've mitigated that enough. I have other things that I can spend my resource on to mitigate some others, and I'm beginning to take to accept a certain level of risk, or to tolerate a certain level of risk, and I won't mitigate it further. And that's making prudent decisions. And things like the much talked about risk appetite statement, put boundaries on that and give you some indicators and guides there. The failure to comply risks get a lot of attention. I put that note in there primarily because when we meet clients, an awful lot of them are afraid of the non-compliance. And there's compliance pieces to the organization, but at the end of the day, what it is it's a risk. It needs to be mitigated. The controls need to be put in place, and you may decide at the end of it that you're going to take a risk, and that then becomes part of your appetite statement. But generally with the compliance stuff, the best thing to do is fully mitigate it and comply. The final one that I put to try and bring this together is what I call the GRC coat hangers, the governance, risk and compliance coat hanger. And running in my head, there's a song, and I can't remember who produced it, is you can't have one without the other. And that's the truth of it. So it's like a balance, it's like a scale. The stakeholders of the governing body accept the upsides and downsides, and there are upsides and downside risks to all the objectives of the enterprise. Some of them, they're failures to comply with regulation, legislation that can result in negative consequence. That can be fines. Probably the bigger issue is if you, depending on the nature of the organization, any bad media publicity arising from a fine or an investigation can be seriously detrimental. And the governance regime is responsible for that. The challenge to, I suppose the biggest challenge here is to effectively resource the proper mitigation of the key risks. And if you include the compliance risks as part of that, the continuing achievement of the compliance requirements will be an inevitable outcome. And to do all of that without damaging the main objectives of the organization. And that's that hang together thing that makes the integration between the governance, who are setting the objectives, and deploying the resources. So it's about the identification, knowing what you have to do from a risk perspective, including in your risk strategy, all of the compliance requirement risks that should you fail to meet, your business will be damaged, and having the resource to make sure that you adequately complete that picture and still are able to achieve your, I call them fun objectives, like growing the sales line, like increasing the profits, like improving the shareholder value, like growing the loan book, or whatever it might be, whatever is part of your business. These three things come together with the base case of managing the risk and managing the compliance. have to be part of the governance responsibility, and an integrated part that isn't superseded by the desire to grow the business faster, or whatever that overarching objective might become. A couple of links I find are useful, often refer back to Warren Buffett. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the newspaper test, but if you're not, we'll share the slides. It's a testimony he made to a Senate committee on the Solomon Bank. Well worth listening to. There's a small piece of it. It's about 1 minute of it where he really hits the nail on the head. The newspaper test worth looking at. A couple of the others, some of the famous failures. Barclays would be famous for anti-money laundering, and recently, the last couple of days, I don't know if you are familiar with it, but William Hill was fined and for some anti-money laundering and counterterrorism finance, and some customer care issues in the UK, and the regulator got as far as suggesting that they were considering not revoking the license of the business. So some of that gets quite serious. Again, the links are there if you want to take a look at them. I'll go to questions and answers. If there's any, I should have asked if there was any at the outset of and told you where to get them. But seeing there are none, I'm making the assumption that as I've exceeded my time, that I'll leave it at that. And thank you for joining us. The slide deck and the YouTube video of the recording will be available when Mairead and the team get it up in the next day or two. Thank you for your time. I have one question, and it's just a compliment, so I must have done okay. Okay, thank you.